Hello everybody and welcome back to ChessDiagnostic. Today we're going to start with a puzzle as white to move. If you want to pause the video now to solve it, now is the time. Alright, so let's get into it. So with this position you can see that immediately the bishop is attacking the queen, and this position directly relates to the game I'm going to be analyzing in this video between Timur RADJABOV and Vidit Gujrathi from Wycombe in 2019. Now you can see that the white bishop is hitting f7 as well as this advanced knight on g5, and we see that basically there's a lot of contact between the pieces. With this rook here, it seems a little oddly placed on h3, but white has a lot of activity. So immediately the forcing moves that should come to mind are bishop check, knight takes, as well as queen takes. Now queen takes looks a little crazy, but that's actually the correct move in this position. And we start with queen takes g6, and now after h takes, you see bishop takes f7, the rook takes is forced. And now this is a very common and important pattern to know with rook to h8 check, and now you see this knight fork. Now this is technically plus 1.6 for white. I would consider this quite a hard position to play, actually, at least to consider it a out and out one game. Now you're basically up a pawn with black having some weak pawns here, but he can fight back pretty hard. And after rook to d8, the correct move would have to be rook to e6. And because the knight covers this f7 square, the king can't really get in. So he has to start moving his knight, which gives you time to get your king in here, support d4, and eventually attack these queenside pawns of black. So that would be the correct strategy there. But I really like this puzzle because it's basically from a real game, and this is the kind of position you would get against a stronger player where you're technically won, but it's not so simple. Alright, so let's just review that pattern. Queen takes, and then this f7 square with the knight fork. This is why basic tactics are really important to know. In terms of pattern recognition, they can help you find and deconstruct more complicated middle game positions. Alright, so let's get into the game here. Alright, now we're going to get into the game between RADJABOV and Gujrathi that was played in Wycombe in 2019. I really like this game for its very clear ideas and dynamic energy as well as the tactics, so let's just jump into it. Before we do, I also wanted to say thanks to Lev and Paul for their generous support of this channel, and that really helps. I'm hoping to hire an editor at some point so that at least if I record a video, I can do it more consistently and not have to spend an hour or two a day trying to edit video. All right, so d4, knight to f6. Now in this game, it looks like a somewhat kind of dry theoretical opening turns into a crazy battle. So we see d4, knight to f6, c4, and then e6. Now the standard move nowadays seems to be knight to f3, kind of trying to sidestep the Nimzo-Indian, which would be if he played knight to c3 and then bishop. And also it leaves open g3 and the Catalan variation, which can be quite dangerous. So with d5, we go into the Queen's Gambit declined, and now the Ragozin with bishop to b4. So in this position, the topical variation is queen to a4 check, and the reason for that is that it drives the knight to c6, because now the b4 bishop is attacked, and the only way to protect it is to play knight to c6. But it's actually somewhat of an awkward position for black, because normally he likes to have this c-pawn go to c6 or c5 to attack the center. But of course, with the queen check, that also spends a tempo checking, and he does develop a piece anyway. So after e3, it's just a developing move, so he can move this bishop, and also protects d4. We see the queen come back, and now rook to e8. So this is a central idea in the Queen's Gambit decline, especially in this variation, where the central idea is the e5 push, which also puts pressure in the center and frees up the light square bishop. So just keep in mind that idea here. And bishop to d2 to prevent something like knight to e4. Now the bishop goes back, and white could play c5, pushing the bishop further back, but it somewhat locks up his own play, and it actually makes it a little easier to play e5. It's perfectly fine, though, for white, but we don't see that in this game. Just an idea. We see h3. Now, I really like this move, and it has two main ideas. It's kind of a waiting move instead of developing the bishop right away, because black likes to take on c4 after white's already moved the bishop. For example, bishop to e2, and then he takes, and he has to move the bishop again. So RADJABOV just kind of makes a waiting move. And the second idea, actually, if black makes some weakening moves on the king side, then white can play g4 and actually castle queenside, which is what we see in this game. So Gujarati goes for some of his own waiting moves, and now he's actually preparing b5 as well. If he takes and then bishop takes, he can play b5, hitting the bishop on c4. All right, so just more waiting moves with a3, also preventing knight to b4. And now RADJABOV just gives in and plays bishop to e2, takes. All right, so the bishop isn't necessarily awkwardly placed. It actually can provide support for the f7 square, but that's just some opening stuff that I've seen grandmasters play. All right, so now we see h6. So the reason for that is if black plays something like e5 right away, then you'll actually see knight to g5, hitting the f7 square, and then you could see a complicated battle if he takes, which would probably be a blunder. But Gujarati doesn't want to allow that, so he plays h6. Now, of course, playing h6, as I talked about earlier, now he can play g4, g5, 2 moves away from ripping open the king side for white against black. And that's exactly what we see. So the interesting thing about this game is that white actually doesn't castle queenside, but that option present is very useful. But we see a very tense battle go right away. We see e5, and now we can't play knight to g5, but RADJABOV plays slightly inaccurately, but practically it's the correct decision. So now black has a lot of activity in the center. He has all of his minor pieces developed. He has this rook bearing down on the king that's uncastled, and he's trying to rip it open with pawns. So what does RADJABOV do? He plays g5. Now, of course, if the pawn takes, then the knight would just take, and we're actually in a slightly more advantageous position. You can see the evaluation goes up +3 for white, and that's because he's actually more active with this h-file ready to be ripped open and hitting f7. Of course, we don't see Gujarati take. He hits back with b5, the bishop goes back, and now we could see something like takes and then takes, but that would actually be a mistake because suddenly it allows black to get active if he takes on f6 eventually, or he could just, let's see. So let's say white takes there. We'll see a line like this where now the pin on the king is very important because the knight can't take because then it's pinned. So these basic tactics are really coming into play, and that's why somewhat it's a little inaccurate, as I said, for RADJABOV, because with the dynamic play and the uncastled king, he can run into trouble. All right, so let's go back. So the funny thing about this position is that the computer says it's 0.0, so exactly equal. But of course, for a human player, when you're playing a very dynamic position where you have to evaluate whether you're sacrificing pieces, then even if the computer thinks it's equal, it's quite hard to play for a human. All right, the bishop goes back, and now as you can see from that puzzle, we're starting to get these kind of positions where the bishop's bearing down on f7, and also the queen's ready to swing over to the king side at any moment. So Gujarati hits back by just trying to open up the center. And now I would like you, if you want to take a moment to try to evaluate this position. It looks like you could take this knight, but that would actually be quite a big blunder if he took, because then actually the queen comes in. And part of the power of white's attack is that the queen And these minor pieces, they're in the center, but they're not on the king side. So if you take and bring the queen over to the king side, then it's somewhat harder to play. And of course, he's actually hitting this f3 knight. This knight's attacked. And if he brings in the bishop here, then, well, of course, he wouldn't really want to take there because then it activates the bishop. But you could see that it's not the best position for white. All right, so RADJABOV actually makes the correct decision and plays g5 takes h. And actually, so let's look at the evaluation of that. So the queen, it's not exactly on the king side, but because he took here, he's going to have to sacrifice a piece. Takes, and now look at these bishops here. And also the queen is ready to come in and threaten checkmate. Of course, the queen could come to g6 because the bishop is pinning the f7 pawn. But this is just a very clear example of the power of two bishops and the queen going over to the king side. All right, so he only has a +1 advantage, as the computer is saying here, and that's largely based on the activity of these bishops, as well as the relative safety of the black king versus the white king. All right, a move in this position would actually be something like bishop to f4, putting pressure on the e3 pawn as well as being ready to take here. Although after he took on c3, it actually causes some problems. But he could play bishop to f4 here, and then he's hitting that pawn and also bringing a piece to the king side. But after he took this knight here and the queen's in, it's a little harder to play. And so he basically contests the bishop here. And after a trade, we see rook to g1. Just putting pressure on g7, quite simple. And now the knight goes back. So I'd like to point out, when you're defending, you always want to look for the moves that increase your activity as well as defend what you're trying to defend. So black wants to defend g7. So instead of the knight back, a better move would have actually been knight to h5, which logically makes sense in that he's keeping the knight on the king side and also increasing the amount of squares that he controls into white's camp. Now, this activity with the rook and the bishop hitting g7 is very, very strong. And this is somewhat of a computer move and a computer defense, but let's say the bishop takes. If you want to try to find the move in this position, there's actually bishop to g3, which I thought was really cool. And now if the pawn takes, then actually he just closed off his own rook, and white's attack is over, and actually black is winning in this position. He could take there and then check. And now you would see if the king comes to protect here, you see a simple tactic. Check, and then check. A fork of the king and the queen. So that would have been a very, very strong defense that would have been somewhat hard for white to parry. All right, so let's not go through too many lines. There could be a lot of lines in this game. Instead, he moved the knight back, and then bishop takes. And now white's getting a ton of activity. If any piece goes here, then it would be checkmate in one move, and white is threatening to check on f7. So the queen comes in, protecting f7 as well as hitting f3. And we see the knight come in, also adding another attacker to f7. Now, any piece, like the rook goes here, there will be a checkmate right away. So it's already starting to get critical, and white has a humongous, almost +6 advantage in this position. Of course, based on the activity of the queen, the rook, and the knight against basically the king, the queen, and the rook. All right, so Gujarati hits back with rook takes check, trying to rip open white's own king's position. Now, if he took here, that would be a very bad idea, because then Gujarati would probably get a draw with just these checks. And between the queen, the knight, and the rook coming in, then he'd probably be able to just get a perpetual. Instead, we see king to f1, which actually the king is pretty well protected with just this one pawn against a rook and a queen. And now finally we see a move back with the knight to protect f7 because he was threatening check, and then he needs another defender. So after the queen check, and then he just pushes the pawn, trying to drive the king further in, Gujrathi tries to hit back with bishop to g3. So there's only one defensive move in this position, if you want to try to find it. You can see that there's a threat of checkmate in one. The rook can't come in to protect it. And there is only knight to f3 and knight to e4. But crazily, knight to e4 solves all of white's problems in terms of defense. And after rook takes and rook takes here, then it's completely winning. So this passed pawn basically means that black is going to lose a rook. And after rook to d1, now this is a great move. It's basically activating the last undeveloped piece and also closing off the d file for the king so he can't escape. And also with a threat of rook to e3, which means the knight would have to interpose and then white would just simply take the rook. Now, RADJABOV's very accurate here. Instead of taking with the queen on h7, he basically checks, and he takes this rook, because now he can go to c6 and bring the rook to d7. And that's what we see here. All right, so this is the last mistake. Even though he's totally lost, the best move would have been rook to d8, trying to prevent the check. But either way, he would be lost after check. Notice that the knight is pinned. And then he would just trade, and this is a completely lost endgame with a rook versus a knight and one extra pawn, especially on the h-file. And so with the king back, we see takes, and after check, he's going to lose a rook. Now, if the queen, if he took with the pawn here, let's go back here. Oh. All right, takes. If he took with the pawn, then you would actually see rook to d7, and there's no way for him to basically stop checkmate. So he'd have to give up his queen, like queen to f7 or queen to e7. And so he has to take with the queen, but these checks, notice that he would go here, and then he would take and be up a rook. And I think, I'm not sure exactly the point. I think it was move 36 that he resigned here. All right, I'm kind of making a mess of this here. All right, so queen takes, check. And then if the pawn comes up, or especially if the queen comes up, he would just take. So the pawn comes up and then the check. If the queen goes here, then he takes, and it basically deflects the king away from the rook. And so at this point, with queen takes c7, Gujrathi resigned, and we have a very amazing game, especially that knight to e4 move. All right, so hopefully this was clear enough. It is a very complicated game, but I thought it was very dynamic, and there's a lot of educational moments in it with some very interesting tactics thrown in. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the future.